Fairy Tale by Stephen King is the first Stephen King book that I've read, and my very first impressions of the book right from the start was just his writing style and how he's able to make anything interesting right away, and he's constantly adding new and interesting ways to engage the reader. This is going to be a non-spoiler review, obviously by the name of the book and like the description of it that you can read like on the back of it. There is a fantasy element to the book, but it starts off in the real world, and it takes place mainly in like 2012, 2013. The character was born, I believe, in 1997, and I was born in 1994, so it was kind of interesting seeing an author who was in his 70s, I believe, write a book with a character that's roughly my age. When he writes the main character, Charlie Reed, as someone who's my age, I find it interesting because how he's able to still have a youthful voice in his book. There were certain things that, being that age, that I thought was a little off, that maybe I didn't experience or feel that way or talk that way in 2012, 2013. The way he injects his age and his Stephen King's knowledge to this 17-year-old character is the character watches a lot of like older movies with his dad. Charlie's able to reference older movies, so I think he probably did that just so he could add a little bit of his own flair to it. Another thing that I noticed with this being my first Stephen King book is the payoffs. There's always he'll introduce, this Charlie, he plays football, his mom died in a car accident. That's not a spoiler, that's kind of the character's backstory. Just anything, whether it be with a gun or a friend or what his dad's life was like. They all have little payoffs throughout the story, and it's not like he introduces all this stuff in the beginning and then it all pays off at the end. No, it's constantly revealing new and interesting things. And when one aspect of the story pays off, then he introduces something else. And it just has this forward momentum that normally when I read a lot of fantasy books, there's not a lot of fantasy books that have this forward momentum that Stephen King is able to write. But I did find let's say the first 30% of the book to be more interesting than the second or the last 70%. That first 30% deal takes place in the real world. I'll talk more about the real world part instead of like the fantasy world part, because I found reading it, part of the reason why I kept going was trying to see what this fairy tale world was like, so I don't want to spoil that for you. So if I'm going to talk about like the beginning part, I found it just more engaging. The story kind of roughly goes that the character Charlie, he interacts with this older man that has like health issues, and then he starts to take care of him, and then they start bonding. And I found that bond between them and then that older man's older dog, I found that way more interesting than the fairy tale part of the story. And that was probably the biggest disappointment that I had with the book, because once you get past that real world part with the real world characters, it just loses a lot of its heart. And I wish that he was able to continue to keep that within the fairy tale part. But not that the fairy tale part's bad, and it definitely has like action and like it does still has that forward momentum, but it was just lacking something that just reading it, that this being my first Stephen King book, it had that opening part just had what I thought a Stephen King book would have, which is coming of age, a lot of heart, great dialogue, great character interactions, and I just wish that the fairy tale part had that as well. This book does feel cliche, which I'm okay with. I don't really have a problem with that, but it works in this book. It feels to me very intentional, because the way it's structured, the way the mythos of the fairy tale world is, it seems like he was really drawing from a lot of inspirations, and I've put up several 70s fantasy books that it reminded me of a little bit. Of these ones that I've read, they all kind of deal with a character in current time going through a portal, going into space accidentally, whatever the imagination of a 70s author had, and then they end up in this fantastical world. That's what I found really cool with this book, is it felt like that, but just in a longer form. A lot of these books from like the 60s and 70s, or maybe even earlier, even the 80s, they're very short. They're like 200 pages, where this is I believe like 600 pages. So I really liked that aspect of it, where it did feel like an old school fantasy, sci-fi fantasy novel. As for like the fairy tale part of it, I couldn't really find any references to like other things other than what's brought up in the book. I have not read a lot of classic fairy tale type stories. The book has many different tones to it, which is another aspect of like keeping something interesting and fresh, because the beginning feels like a coming of age story, then it kind of gets a little sad, and then it gets all beautiful and colorful, and then it gets really dark and depressing, and then action packed. And it just has all different tones to it. So when you're reading it, although the beginning feels so different to the end, it does make it so you don't feel like you're just sitting there reading a really long book for a long time. So if you're somebody that's not used to reading like 600-page books, this may not feel as long for you, because it just feels so different throughout it that might not be as big of a hindrance as you would expect. So with this being my first Stephen King book, I thought it would be a great opportunity for people that have read all Stephen King books to let me know another book that's maybe similar to this, or maybe something that's completely different that he has written that would be a great next book for me to read of his. And I thought maybe if people would be interested, I could make a video on that book, and then, I don't know, just keep kind of going with different Stephen King books if people find that interesting. Because I know that in a lot of different communities, even like the Wheel of Time, the veterans of the series love to see new reader experiences for that. So for the next book of his that I would read, I wouldn't mind if it was a shorter novel for now. I'm not going to have as much time to read a big novel. So I would really love if somebody could tell me the next book that I would read of his that you'd like me to make a video on. With that, I want to thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you on the next one.